Hello.
Hey, hello, hi class. Guys, I'm not even going to begin to tell you the dramatic things that have been going on with me. But I promise you, I promise you, I'm getting on your grades this weekend. Okay. I'm so sorry. Uh,
No worries.
so thank you so much for waiting on me with that. But I really don't feel presumptuous in telling you that I bet you're doing a great job. I really do. And remember, it's a cherry on top when you write well, but you don't have to write well. Okay.
Yeah.
You have to capture the thesis, have an intelligent idea about its credibility, and I'm happy. Okay.
Mhm.
So I bet you guys have done above and beyond. Uh, so at any rate, are you guys doing okay?
Yeah. I was just gonna ask about the grades today, mainly because, like, I just wanted to make sure my grade was gonna be decent in the class, just because I didn't do that great on the exam. It was really challenging, and so I just wanted to confirm that my grades were good elsewhere because,
Yes.
yeah,
And
I want to
remember,
make sure that I can maintain a good grade.
sure. Remember a couple things, Jake. Um, for one, that's why your your tests are only three things that are worth 50 points, and you're doing like 18 to 20 assignments that are worth 50 points each. So when you do
Hmm.
well on those assignments, it overwhelms the test scores. And I do reserve the
Okay.
right if you are swiveling between two grades and you're fairly close to the ascending grade and you're coming to Zoom and I could tell that you're putting effort into your write-ups, I absolutely reserve the right to bump your grade up. And I don't feel badly about that at all.
Great. Thank you
Okay,
so
so
much.
no problem. I was the same
Also,
way.
I just wanted to let you know I have to leave at 5:10 today. I have sports practice. So
Oh, okay,
uh
okay, sure.
I'm not sure if class will run that long, but just in case it does, I may have to pop out.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you for letting me know. Um,
Yeah.
no, I understand. I completely understand. And
I
I
figured it
I
was worth it
too, I'm
to
gonna try to
come for
be
the
done
first
by
half.
then. I'm sorry?
Cool. I figured it was worth it just to come even if I couldn't finish, just in case.
Yes.
You know?
No, it absolutely is worth it. To me for sure. Um, yeah, and I intend to try to balance, not shortchanging you guys at all, but at the same time trying to be as succinct as possible. Because I too, I my boy came back from sixth grade camp and we're gonna go trick or treating and see. I still have a
Nice.
grandmother at 90 years of age. We're gonna go see her, and so I get it. It being on Halloween and all that. Um, yeah, congratulations with your Dodgers, Jake.
Why, thank you so much. It was a crazy game. Like I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was pretty
Yeah.
happy.
Yeah, I saw the Yankees get ahead 3-0 in the first inning.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's
I was not
crazy.
too feeling too good about that game, but we pulled through.
They did. All right. And so I'm gonna oh there we go. I have Bryce. That's great. Hi Bryce.
Hello, Mr. Bell.
Hope you're doing well.
Yes,
Um
indeed.
uh you guys, this is great. I love this class. But I'm gonna go ahead and jump right into it, okay? So we're doing the Constitution and it's a little bit different. It's set up in a different manner. It's not in argumentative fashion. And I have three general categories, right? So to me, enlightened is anything that wants to prevent any mechanism built in to prevent tyranny. I mean, to me, it's that simple. That was one of the ultimate goals of the French Enlightenment. And so anything with involving checks and balances, involving accountability, involving um what's the word I'm thinking of? Where you're accountable by way of being able to see transparency, right? Transparency would be enlightened. Yeah, I mean, just to me, it's that simple in my head. And then conservative, right? Equally simple is anything that is not really new in the early modern era. So in the early modern era, a lot of nations began to take form, and they centralized their authority. Because I know in the medieval time period things were decentralized, but to me, centralization was well established enough by the 1780s that I would consider it conservative. Okay, so anything, for instance, that gives a lot of power to the federal government, anything that conserves an institution like slavery, is technically conservative to me. Okay, also with conservative, you have the notions of stability, the general welfare, putting down rebellions, anything like that, right? Those are conservative aims by government, and I would include them as conservative as well. Okay, and in addition to that, any office that is not necessarily democratic, that's not too accountable to the popular will, that's not accountable by frequent elections, I would make the argument is rather conservative. Okay. And so to me, those three criteria, conserving that which was already existing, and namely a centralized power over the local areas, conserving any kind of institution as well, like slavery, right? And yeah, just those three categories are the manner by which I would define subjectively conservative. Okay. And let's see here. Then lastly is simply pragmatic. And pragmatic is just practical. It's not necessarily liberal or conservative, enlightened, etc. It's just a very practical oriented facet to the Constitution. And so I'm going to give you my 2 cents on some of this stuff, okay? So I put under here, Article 1, Section 2, I thought was enlightened. House reps are directly elected by citizens every 2 years and must be inhabitants of the congressional districts in which they represent. Okay, so notice I kind of put it in my own words. I cited the article in the section, and I kind of just put it in a single sentence. It's fine. What that article is all about. And then just in at least one sentence, I try to defend why I put it in that category. I put this is enlightened because they are frequently held accountable to their constituents via election, are privy to what their constituents face daily and having a residence in their constituents' environment, and are more accountable to their constituents by living in proximity to them. All right. So then what I would ask is you to name 3 more articles. All right. And now at one point, I had it down to a science where I wanted so many from Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, but I ceased to do that. I just don't want to see all your examples from Article 1. Okay. Try to spread it out a little bit, your examples. And as you know, Article 1, they chose it as 1 symbolically because it's the democratic element. It involves the House reps who are popularly elected by the citizens, and they make the laws, right? And so kind of like government by consent. They made the legislator, Congress, Article 1. Article 2, of course, is the executive, with the president and his cabinet and the vice president. And Article 3 is the Supreme Court. All right, excuse me. Pragmatic. I put Article 1, Section 8. That federal Congress can deal with practical issues like bankruptcies, inventions, borrowing money, excuse me, and defending the nation against revolts and invasions. This seems pragmatic, and that such issues will almost inevitably need to be dealt with sooner or later. Okay? So that's why I put that as pragmatic. So look at the preamble. We the people, in order to, notice how all of them except the last one are conservative. Perfect a more perfect union. That's a little slight to the Confederation, right? And its failure. Establish justice, ensure tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. All of those arguably are conservative aims. And then finally, the last one, and secure the blessings of liberty, is an enlightened reason for which we put together the Constitution, supposedly. So as I mentioned, Article 1, Section 2 right here of the House Reps. And then look at this. No person shall be a rep who shall not have attained to the age of 25. Now, this is just me, and I love this, is you guys will put things in a different category than I might. And that's why I like your sentence in justifying why you defined it as such. And it honestly teaches me lessons. I love that part of this assignment, is I can learn perspectives and learn things from you. But me personally, I kind of subjectively think my first thought on the 25 years is that it's pragmatic, that it's practical, that they want you to be of a certain age. They want you to have tasted life and experiences for a certain amount of time before they think you're ready to govern. And remember Plato, right? I think his famous number was 30 or 35. I can't remember, in Plato's Republic. You take the best and brightest of kids from school, you separate them, you train them, you make them deal not only with academia, but with altruistic endeavors and serving the people. And then they're ready to serve at 30 or 35. And so I'm going to skip through. I'm not going to go through every one. All right. You might think number 4 is pragmatic. When vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority shall issue a writ of election to fill such vacancies. That's probably going to happen. And so that's a practical solution for that contingency, should that pop up. Okay. Let's see here. The Senate, you get 2 from each state, right? Regardless of a population. And they're chosen by the state legislator. You could argue that that's a bit conservative. They're 1 step removed from being popularly elected. As a matter of fact, you could almost argue they're 2 steps away, right? Because our founding fathers did not elect for universal citizenship, not even universal citizenship for men, not even universal citizenship for men barring Native Americans, because they're treated as a nation within the nation in this document. Right? But each state gets to decide its own criteria for citizenship. And then they serve a 6-year term. That's a relatively long term. And yeah, so that might be considered conservative. And then they alternate, right? So you have a third of them elected, and then 2 years later, a third of them elected, and 2 years later, a third of them elected. Some people think that's pragmatic. Like kind of like perhaps in basketball, you have 5 players out there and you don't want to sub all 5 at once. You want to keep a couple of the guys that are in there that have experience during that evening's game, at least 2 or 3 of them at any given time, and only sub in 1 or 2 at a time. So you have that. And then they have the years, right? You got to be 30 years old to be a senator. And the poor vice president, right? There's not much granted to him or her. The vice president shall have no vote unless it be a tiebreaker in the Senate. Okay, let's see here. The fact that they can make their own laws and choose their own officers, some might argue that that's enlightened because it's keeping the separation of the 3 branches and letting the Senate be autonomous within itself without entanglement from the president or another branch. The Senate shall have the sole power to trial impeachments, and we kind of skipped that one, but the House has the right to formally accuse or impeach the president, right? And they try the president. So that's all part of checks and balances. And you might argue and say that that's enlightened. Let's see here. Congress shall assemble at least once a year. The parliaments had to wait until the king or queen uh, declared their unification. And so now they have to meet at least once a year. That's a good thing. Maybe pragmatic, maybe enlightened. Let's see here. Look at this one, how this one takes a 180. Section 5, number 3. Each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings, and from time to time publish the same. That's transparency. That's enlightened, right? We get to see what they're up to. Accepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. That's very conservative, right? They can decide what to publish and what not to publish. Let's see here. You can't serve in 2 different offices. That might be pragmatic. That might be enlightened. Number 2 in section 6, because in the British system, you could. And some people utilize their position, one position, to accrue personal benefits in the second position. And then I think most would agree section 7.1 is enlightened. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House, because the House is elected by the citizens. So taxation by representation, right? But note, you have the House reps, you have the senators, you have the president and vice president, you have the cabinet, and you have the judiciary. 5, right? How many of them are elected by the citizens directly? The House reps. That's it. 1 out of 5. 1 out of 5. That's not that democratic of a republic. And as you know, in the 19-teens, we changed it so that the senators are directly elected now as well, around 1917. And so now we have 2 of the 5 that are directly elected by citizens. So then it goes through the process of checks and balances, right? It has to pass each branch, and the president has 10 days to veto it or accept it. And should he veto it, they could override that veto with a supermajority of 2/3. So that's all part of checks and balances. And I think most people would probably consider that enlightened because that comes from Montesquieu's ideas in his book. All right, let's see here. Article 1, Section 8. Some would say this entire section, when you look at its entirety, because it's so relatively comprehensive, what Congress can do, that it's conservative. When you compare it to the Confederacy that we had before, right? This is giving considerably more power to the central government, to the central legislator, than ever was given to it under the Articles of Confederation. Okay, they could declare war, raise an army, put down rebellions, right? Regulate interstate trade. But some of these are very practical. To establish post offices, to deal with bankruptcies, to consider a system of incentivizing inventors and patents. That could be considered pragmatic. Let's see here. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union. Remember, if you're a Scottish libertarian, that's scary. You want the state and local militias to stay virtually autonomous. Because within the militia, first of all, right, you're thinking of Second Amendment rights. You're thinking of what if the government, the central government, tried to turn on its own people? You want local and state militias to be powerful, to be able to withstand that threat should it ever arise. And then also, when you look at the militias, they oftentimes democratically elected their own militia leaders. So the fact that if there's an emergency, Congress could declare all the state militias under their jurisdiction, that's kind of conservative. Okay, but it also could be pragmatic. 17 is Congress has direct jurisdiction over Washington, D.C. But look at this last one. A lot of people would say, again, that this is either pragmatic because they don't know the contingencies that are going to arise in the future, or it can be considered conservative because it's known as the elastic clause, right? That if it's not on this list, Congress shall still be able to do whatever is necessary and proper in addition to this list, as long as they can connect it to one of these rights. So, for instance, right, the bank under Hamilton, the U.S. Bank, there's nothing in Article 2 that says the executive could establish a national bank. But they say, right, that that Congress must regulate interstate trade. And they connected it to a couple more. And they said, therefore, it's necessary and proper to have a bank to be able to do so. So you see what I mean? You could really augment your powers at the federal level with this necessary and proper clause. All right. Then the importation of slaves. Look, they say such persons. They always keep it very, they use euphemisms. They don't want to put slaves in here, but it is. You cannot take the floor, and you cannot speak about and bring forth a proposition to end the slave trade until 1808. They call it the gag rule. Okay, so you can't touch it until 1808, kicking that can down the road. Habeas corpus literally means to have a body, that you have to be present when you are being formally convicted of something, formally even suspected of something, and indicted. But if it's a case of rebellion or invasion, they can still indict you in absentia while you're not even there. Okay. I don't remember what bill of attainder, shame on me, but you know, ex post facto law, right? Is that they make a law declaring some activity to be illegal, and then they convict you for having violated that law before it became a law. They can't do that, thankfully. Yeah. So no ex post facto laws. Okay. Let's see here. Number 6, by the way, the South is going to contend that certain tariffs were so instrumentally helpful for the textile factories in the North and harmful on the cotton industry in the South that they contended that number 6 was violated with the abominable tariffs. And that's leading to their secession. So that'll get interesting in the future. Number 8, I think anybody would agree, is probably enlightened. No title of nobility shall be granted to anybody, and no person holding office can accept a title of nobility from England or some country that does offer them. All right. And then number 10, you could say, is conservative. A lot of people would. It's telling the states what they cannot do, what they cannot do. So these are the jurisdiction of the federal government and not the states. So California can't make a treaty with China, right? They can't join a confederation. They can't coin their own money, etc. Let's see here. The executive, that electoral system is just Byzantine. It's quite confusing. The number of electoral points, right, are tied to how many congressmen you have. You have one House rep for every 30,000 civilians, and then you have 2 senators no matter what. But so you add that number together, right? And initially we had actual electors. We had actual people. So let's say, what are we at? Like around 58 points in California, give or take. They would have had originally 58 men and women. And of course, back then it would have been all men. They would have had 58 men and they actually go to their state capital and put in the vote. And they're supposed to follow what the voters contended, right? The choice of the majority of voters in that state. But nothing theoretically kept them from going in a different direction, these electors. And it was known for an elector or two to have chosen someone who was not popularly elected in the state. Yeah, it's crazy. So at any rate, you have to be a natural born citizen, and you have to have lived here for, you have to be 35 years of age, and you have to have been a resident and lived here in the US for 14 years. That might be considered pragmatic, and that might be considered conservative. Okay, a practical remedy if the presidency is vacated. Look at number 8. Before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So that is reminding the president that this is a country of the rule of law, right? That by the consent of the people, the Constitution is sovereign over us, not a person. So that probably would be considered enlightened. And then Congress raises the army, Congress declares war, but then the president becomes the commander in chief once war is declared. So that, to me, that's kind of just checks and balances. And then from time to time, the president shall give to Congress information of the State of the Union, the State of the Union address, right? And this has really changed because, you know, if you read by the letter here and take it literally, it's just simply keeping the Congress up to page as to what he's privy to that they may not be, especially when it comes to foreign policy, because he's in charge of choosing his ambassadors and engaging in treaties and foreign diplomacy. But right, so kind of like transparency and communication. But now, right, with the presidents, you have, like, you know, Teddy Roosevelt, they call it the bully pulpit. He would say, all right, Congress, here's what needs to be done. We need to fix the budget. We need to do this. We need to do that, right? And then they'll even suggest or threaten, we've had presidents do, and say, if you don't address these issues, I'm going to go to the press. I'm going to go over your head to the people, and they're not going to be happy about it. All right, so that's the State of the Union. Impeachment, let's see here. So the judicial power. I technically, subjectively, think Section 2 of Article 3 is pragmatic. All of these cases have occurred. Treaties made. Ambassadors, ministers and consuls, the Navy. The U.S. is one party and another country is another. Citizens of one state against citizens of another. A state against a citizen of another, right? And the list goes on. They have direct jurisdiction. They have to address these issues. They have to adjudicate or referee such cases. If it's not on that list, they have complete latitude to choose, right? So you hear people right going up through the appellate system of the appellate courts, and they request the Supreme Court to accept their plea in their case. In those cases, they don't have to, and supposedly they throw out and deny a lot more cases than they accept. And remember also, is these men are handpicked for life. So that definitely seems conservative, right? But in the extent of checks and balances, you think about it, even though the Senate is indirectly elected, you have a legislator or Congress that is elected by the people and therefore has to be accountable to the majority's will if they want to be reelected. And even though you have an electoral system, you still have a president who's elected by the citizens of the states and, in one way or another is accountable to the people. So you don't want the tyranny of the majority. You don't want the majority to just throw their weight around against the numerical minority. Someone needs to defend them. The Supreme Court was created for that. All right. Not just that reason, but that's one of the reasons. Is they're handpicked for life. They don't have to be popular. Right. And so the famous Brown versus the Board of Education case against segregation in schools for Black kids. They made the right decision, we agree. That's unconstitutional. But do you think if they would have had a popular referendum, like a popular vote on it, that it would have passed? No way. It wasn't a popular decision. Right. Let's see here. I don't understand section 2 and 1 under Article 4. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. The reason why I say that is that was precarious. That wasn't the case. For instance, there were 5 northern states that gave Black men citizenship. But if they moved out of any of those 5 states, they did not have it recognized in their new state. What people largely agree upon, that it was the 14th Amendment at the end of the Civil War that finally made the citizenship rights, the Bill of Rights and its protections. It finally nationalized that, the 14th Amendment in 1868. Of course, I would probably call number 3 conservative. No person held to service under any law of any state, if he or she escapes to another state, shall be discharged from that labor, but shall be delivered up to the old state and put back under service. That's a fugitive slave law. Isn't it funny how they put it in such words that it's kind of vague and they're not owning up to it? Like, okay, if a slave runs away, he's got to be repatriated back to his state and put back in bondage. All right, let's see here. I don't want to be here forever with you on just this first one. This shows you how amendments are made. That might be practical. I don't know. Let's see here. All debts contracted and engagements entered into before the Constitution are just as valid after the Constitution. That arguably is conservative. Someone owes money, he still owes money. Someone has money owed to him, he still has money owed to him. Someone's under a contract to be a slave, he's still a slave, etc. Let's see here. And then you have the 10th Amendment, the 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. Freedom of expression, peaceful protest, right to bear arms, no quartering of soldiers, which is a little bit out of touch today, a little bit obsolete. And then like 4 through 6 or 7 at least are due process, right? If you've been indicted for a crime. Notice 10. The powers not delegated to the U.S. nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states. That's the federal part of our Constitution, right? Is the states sharing power with the central government. So technically, right, we devised a constitutional, because that's supposed to be the ultimate sovereign entity of the republic. We have a constitutional federal republic. Okay? So just all I ask is that you just think of three for each of those three categories. And then with this one's not original at all. This is an old thesis as well. And that is right, perception is reality. That I make the argument that I don't think Alexander Hamilton was really that far to the right. He was an abolitionist. He wanted a democratic republic. He wanted a written constitution that was the ultimate sovereign entity of the republic. You know what I mean? I mean, yes, he did say that he didn't want the republic to be too democratic because the average people were led by their passions and were ignorant and inadequately educated. He did say, right, that while everybody is equally entitled to the protections of the law and privileges of the law, not everyone is equally capable of being a good politician, right? Just like not everyone's equally capable of writing an English paper for you or fixing your car. That we're all different with our experiences, our training, and our gifts, our talents. So yeah, he was conservative, but not that conservative. But what he did, right? Sometimes perception is reality. What he did looked very conservative. Okay. So he takes over the state's debts because he wants us to have pristine credit around the globe. Okay. But in doing so, if you think like a good libertarian, what the government does for you for good today, it might do for harm tomorrow, right? And now he's getting involved in the state budgets at the federal level. He's getting in their business. So that was a red flag to libertarians who feared big government. Then he establishes a federal bank. And yes, it was part private and part public. But still, the part that was public was scary, right? Because England had a national bank as well. So we're going backward in the route of England. He wanted to create a commercial and industrial revolution. Okay. The commercial part is trade. So hence, he knew that people would often want to go the quickest route to profit when they decided as an entrepreneur what they wanted to do as their business, right? Whatever yields the quickest, easiest profit. But things like roads and canals and later railroads and telegraph wires, that's a lot more work. That requires a lot more capital investment at the start. So you have to give an incentive for people to do that. So hence he wanted to help fund the costs of doing it, known as subsidizing or subsidies. Okay. So if you could convince the government that what you were doing was good for the entire national economy, the government would help pay for it. All right. And so not only did he want infrastructure of like trade and communication and get one region connected to another commercially, but he also wanted diversification. He wanted us to grow a myriad of different industries so we did not become or remain economically dependent upon any European country for their goods and products, right? So if you're starting a new industry that there's not much history in this country with, he'll subsidize you once again. But oftentimes, right, especially with infrastructure, it's so expensive that only the big wealthy businessmen were able to do it. So what does it look like, right? It looks a bit like a plutocracy, a rule by the government in the pockets of big business. Okay. And then in addition to that, he needed to raise money to be able to subsidize all these people. So he started issuing taxes. And remember, he's handpicked on the cabinet. He was not elected. So he's taxing without our representation. And get this, he taxed luxury goods. And one of the main goods that was taxed was tea. Kind of ironic, huh? And so at any rate, and including whiskey. And then in addition to that form of revenue from taxation is he wanted to borrow money from the citizens. And that was known as the bond, right? Is you buy a bond certificate at a certain price, whatever price you're willing to lend the government, and it pays you back at a handsome interest rate. So that, you know, you're not lending money out of the goodness of your heart, right, to the government. But then again, who has the money on the side to be able to lend to the government? And by the way, the government deliberately dragged its heels paying these people back. The wealthy, of course, the wealthy. So he's getting loans from the wealthy. He's helping the businesses of the wealthy, right? And then he creates this constitutionally dubious national bank. And guess how he gets away with it? It goes to the Supreme Court, and the lawyers argue that it is necessary and proper, right? That elastic clause that scared the libertarians from the beginning. He's already using it. So then there was a Whiskey Rebellion, and he raised an army of 13,000. That's larger than the Continental Army against Great Britain to squash this Whiskey Rebellion. So you see what I'm saying? He became perceived as being so uber conservative that it provoked libertarians to unite and form an oppositional party known as the Democratic Republicans. And then it'll just be truncated to Democrats at the time of Andrew Jackson around 1828. Okay? So this is great man history. Remember, it doesn't mean that you're a great man ethically. Great man history has to do with causation. You believe why things happen the way they do is because of the decisions and personalities of men in great positions of power. So most of this, if not all of this assignment, is great man history. And it's kind of passe, to be honest. A lot of people like history from below, right? Where they look at evidence for like the common people and what they thought and what they did, etc. There's structural history, strong forces that are bigger than any individual, like the economy and culture. So it's not real popular anymore, but it used to be incredibly popular. And so I thought I'd at least do one assignment on great man history. And we're going to do it at least one more time with, I couldn't resist the temptation, Abraham Lincoln. All right, we'll do some great man history with him in the future. So at any rate, Hamilton became perceived to be so uber conservative that he literally provoked enough organized opposition to begin our two-party system. So he is to blame for the two-party system. It's a little simplistic, but it's a popular thesis. Then number 2 is David McCullough in his biography on John Adams, our second president. All right. And what he does, right, is he shows how he alienates, because his whole book kind of revolves around why he thinks he lost re-election, why he became our first one-term president. Okay. And it's real simple, his thesis. He alienates both sides. Okay. He was pretty conservative, kind of like Hamilton. He has some very elitist quotes that make him look more conservative than he really was. Okay. And so when the French Revolution happened, there were many Americans who believed that the French were finally faithfully carrying out the French Enlightenment to its full conclusions, while we had not, right? There were people who were saying that Hamilton alone, as the Secretary of Treasury, was corrupting and reversing what they called the spirit of 76, the time in which we were allegedly at our most enlightened when we declared independence. Okay? So John Adams is the same way by his critics. The French Revolution happens, and he sees very little good in it. He looks at its, quote, excesses, how it went too far. They declared, right, the culottes, those who were able to afford the pantaloon pants with socks. That was the euphemism they used for the rich. And they themselves, the people, right, called themselves the sans culottes, without the culottes, because they couldn't afford them. And so the sans culottes declared the culottes to be enemies of the state just by virtue of their socioeconomic standing. They hadn't even done anything treasonous, but by virtue of being nobles and having, of course, exploited the laborers on their lands, they were declared enemies of the state, and they were beheaded by the thousands, right, with the guillotine under Jacobin rule. So he thought that was way too excessive. And then also they went against the Catholic Church and even Christianity. And so they turned the Cathedral of Notre Dame into the temple of the goddess of reason. They declared a new year off the Judeo-Christian calendar. They beheaded priests. So therefore, John Adams, being a pretty staunch Christian, not even Catholic, said that this was of the Antichrist. This was of the devil. Okay. So at any rate, when the French Revolution happened, and then they have chaos, right, at the fall of the Jacobins, and then who comes into the mayhem but Napoleon? And he has this famous Napoleonic Code. Now, there is much to brag about in that Napoleonic Code, if you look that up. Political equality for women is just one thing that was rather impressive about that code. But it was kind of an oxymoron, though, right? Because it was spread by force with Napoleon's army, and it was led by an enlightened despot, an enlightened tyrant, the emperor, as he called himself, Napoleon Bonaparte. So at any rate, he was very polarizing, right? He caused people to love or hate him. And so he fights Austria and Prussia and England. And right away, everyone knows our president is on the side of the latter, right? And of course, what do they wisely call themselves? The Holy Alliance, saying that Napoleon is the Antichrist. So at any rate, John Adams jumps on this, right? And he's like, all right, I know the previous president, Washington, declared neutrality in these continental wars, but I'm going to make it clear that I have nothing but disdain for Napoleonic France. Okay. So then what he does is he was a bit instrumental in two things that were very controversial. One, he begins raising a navy and has them have engage in a convoy system in the Caribbean. So that they only have a few times a year when the merchants are allowed to leave the main ports of Charleston, in New Orleans, etc. And they're chaperoned by American war frigates, warships. Okay. Because what both sides were doing is they were stopping our merchants on the sea and confiscating their stuff, because they were trying to blockade each other and starve each other into submission. So when the French did that, right, when they tried, we had the Navy now. And so, of course, almost inevitably, they began having battles. And we killed, we had men lost, etc. And it was known as the almost or quasi war, okay, in the Caribbean. But notice, right, Congress hasn't declared war. He's doing this irrespective of the fact that Congress constitutionally is to raise the army and declare war first before he could be an acting commander-in-chief. Then secondly, which alarmed the liberals, is his Congress passes two constitutionally doubtful, dubious laws. One was the Alien Act. That it makes it clear in Article 1, Section 8, that Congress has jurisdiction over naturalization and immigration. They granted that power momentarily to the president and said you could deport any French radicals from this country, because we had thousands of Jacobin clubs here throughout our republic. And they were trying to raise money and even trying to get people to volunteer as mercenary fighters to fight with the French in these continental wars. So at any rate, the second law was the Espionage Act. And it's a little bit vague, but it still looks like it infringes on our First Amendment right. It just says that if your expression in any way encourages sabotage of our naval effort or sabotage of our government, then you're not allowed to say or speak it. So it was kind of a curtailment, a cutting short of our First Amendment right. Okay, and that's going to happen again in the future, right? But it's still very controversial and scary because the First Amendment is huge, obviously, in American political tradition and in American minds. So he has all this happening, right? And so the liberals despise him. But then he feels badly in his conscience about these two laws, so he hardly deports anybody. He could have easily used the Espionage Act to shut down the Aurora and the National Gazette and other newspapers that were hostile to the conservatives, and he didn't. He allowed them to continue. And so he didn't use it as an instrument of repression at all, because supposedly it went against his conscience. Then in addition to that, Haiti had their famous slave rebellion and revolution. And he recognized this new, quote, black slave regime in Haiti. And conservatives of all stripes were just aghast that he did. Then he would not ask Congress to declare war against the French like the uber conservatives wanted. Instead, he allowed even a private citizen to go to France because he thought he had good intentions and had good credentials to try to convince the French not to go to war with us. So that alienated the conservatives. And then he did not like personally Alexander Hamilton. He called him a vain peacock. And so he angered Hamilton, and that did him political damage. So in a sense, right, McCulloch, instead of attributing John Adams' failure to be reelected to some deficiencies in character, ironically does the opposite, right? And says this guy actually had too much of a mind of his own. This guy actually had too much personal integrity and go in his own direction on things so that he alienated both sides. Okay? And ultimately, right, he contended as a Christian that he was going to have to answer to God for every decision that he made. And so therefore he didn't care about what man or man-made institution thought about his decisions. And not to mention, he was a little bit of a curmudgeon. He was a little bit grouchy, a little bit quickly irritable, and did not get along well with other human beings very well. Extremely bright. All right, so that's number 2. And number 3 is the mommy and daddy thesis, right? The mommy and daddy thesis of Jefferson. In this one, right, Jefferson's mom is high-ranking Scottish nobility, the Randolph family, and she marries down to a commoner named Peter Jefferson, his dad. His dad was known to be a very good man, and by virtue of coverture, everything of hers became his when they married. Her parents were furious. He tries to placate them and allowing them to live with him and his wife. That did not help. Jefferson supposedly hates the way they treat his dad, but he doesn't have the spine to do anything about it. He also experiences wealth guilt because his dad is outside doing farm work and he won't let him help him with it. He says, no, son, use that Randolph name of your mother's and get the finest of education and go as high as you can. And so, right, so he develops a complex of wealth guilt, right? And he has this subconscious desire to impress his dad and show some type of loyalty in his adulthood to his dad and the way he was treated by his in-laws. And therefore, he magnifies in his rhetoric the common man, the common yeoman farmer who grows his own food and is not a commercial crop farmer who's greedy for profit. Okay. And so he does symbolic things. He refuses to ride in a chariot to the White House. He walks on foot. He dresses very shabbily and doesn't have his hair very well kempt. He insists on answering the door to the White House himself and not having a servant do so. He invites poor neighbors to dinners, the same dinners where he has noblemen from Europe and statesmen from the US invited to. And sometimes he would snub them, the latter, and put most of his affection on his poor neighbors at the dinner table. And so he was, I think you're dealing with a little bit of passive aggression as well, right? And a little bit of compensation, trying to convince himself and trying to convince his dad, long after his dad passed, that he was not an elitist snob like his mom's family. So I thought that was cool. Okay, that's Richard Hofstadter. It's called American Political Tradition, and it is a wonderful book. Number 4, Jefferson, okay, had early life rhetoric. And namely, he wrote letters to a French friend, and the French friend asked him his opinion on a myriad of things because he thought Jefferson was so well read and so bright. And he would write these long answers to everything, his opinion and facts, etc., right, on the state of things in America. And Madison had it published, supposedly unbeknownst to Jefferson, and Jefferson was angry, but he had it published, and it's called Notes on the State of Virginia, if you ever wanted to read it. And he's pretty enlightened and pretty liberal in those writings, right? He excoriates slavery, just hates it. He's against the idea of nobility. He believes that democracy is the least of all evils, that yes, people will be passionate and ignorant, but the consequences of that passion and ignorance will not be as deadly as the consequences of being ruled by oligarchs who know exactly what they're doing, who are well educated, but who are just very bad human beings, okay, and hungry for power and wealth. So at any rate, you look at those early writings, and then you look at him as president, and there are a lot of contradictions, a lot of contradictions. And so Alan Brinkley makes it very simple. He says this guy was so non-confrontational, so timid and shy, right? But also so sharp that when he saw forces that were too large to be reckoned with, he caved in from being an idealist, as in his youth. Remember, an idealist doesn't see the world as it is, but sees it as it should be and wants to improve man and improve institutions. But instead, right, he turned into a pragmatist. He decided to make the practical decision in every situation he found himself in as president. So to him, right, he didn't change with power or with age and become conservative. He wasn't a lying hypocrite as far as what he had written, but he just simply, when he saw opposition and felt opposition, he quit. He gave in and said, you know what, I'm just going to make the pragmatic decision instead of the idealistic one. Okay? And so I need you to know some of the main examples of that Alan Brinkley uses in his book. Okay, so one, of course, I think of is the Louisiana Purchase. As a libertarian, he said, if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. Nowhere in the Constitution under Article 2 does it say the president can purchase territory. But he said, future generations will pardon me for the benefits that will be accrued. Okay, so first of all, buying all that land, that's going to be land offered to the poor, because that was always his answer for the poor, was to grant them land further west. Okay. Secondly, he said that Napoleon is mercurial. He's like bipolar. And Napoleon owned that land that was contiguous, touching ours on the Mississippi. And he said that that's a scary thing. He could invade us. And so it was good to get rid of that threat. Okay. And then while he's doing it, he sends Lewis and Clark. And I know this is a simplistic simplification, but there's a lot of truth to it nevertheless, is Meriwether Lewis to me represented his intellectual interest. Meriwether Lewis found mastodon bones and wrote about them and brought some back. The flora, the fauna, Native American culture and language, etc. Right? His intellectual curiosities. But to me, Clark was a bit of a military spy. He would come in and he wrote down which tribes were likely to be hostile in the future against U.S. encroachment and which ones could be bought, what their strength in numbers were and their military capacity was, etc. Okay. And so, all right. So then another pragmatic thing he did is when he buys it, right? The demographics of people that are in it. You had Cajuns from Acadia, Canada. They rebelled during the French and Indian War against Britain while Britain was fighting the French. And the French forcefully deported many of them to New Orleans. So they had a rebellious reputation, known as the Cajuns. Then the Creoles. The Creoles were there from 1713, and they were very elitist. They were pre-French Revolution, pre-Enlightenment. And so they wanted only the educated, well-connected French nobles to rule. And then you also had Native American tribes. You also had Spaniards at times when it went back and forth from Spain to France, jurisdiction-wise. And then you also had a guy named Wilkinson who tried to sell that territory, allegedly, as a military U.S. leader to a foreign country. And so, and he had a trial and everything. And so at any rate, right, Thomas Jefferson did not feel safe to allow democratic government immediately in that swath of land. He thought we would lose it just as soon as we bought it. So he handpicked 21 leaders in the North, handpicked 21 leaders in the South, and said, you know what, when they become states in the future, then they'll be guaranteed Republican form of government. But for now, we can't do it. Another thing that he did that was that was against his rhetoric was slavery. He did not even free his slaves at death. He was indebted, and he gave his slaves to his daughter to help her get out of his debt. He said an example of the hubris, right? The blind, ignorant arrogance of slave owners. Nothing shows it better than them having amorous affections and relationships with slave women. Because after all, what are the slave women going to say? Right? So he says it makes sycophants of the slaves. A sycophant is someone who is utterly dependent on someone else that has power over him or her. And so he or she often has to resort to some type of pandering, right? And kissing up to get any type of privileges and powers, etc. So that person is going to become dishonest, is going to become a flatterer, etc. And he says that's what slaves are made into under this arbitrary system of slavery. So he says it's a joke for a white master to have a black lover as a slave, and he does that. He falls for Sally Hemings. He takes her to France regularly, and yes, they were more progressive in France, so they could be kind of equals because his wife had died in childbirth, giving birth to their second daughter, and so Sally Hemings gives birth to 4 kids, and one infamous time, the oldest son Beverly insisted that he be able to leave at 18. And he promised him he would. And then word got out about their affair. And he said, I need time for things to cool down before you could go. And Beverly ran away. And they captured him, brought him back. And then he finally let Beverly go. And I don't know of any future relations between the two. They were soured. He had a youngest named Eston. They said that was just like his dad, Thomas, but much darker in skin color. He loved to read. He loved music. They had a great relationship, and he let Eston go. And they both embraced and cried, etc. But he didn't have the courage to own up to his relationship publicly with Sally Hemings. He didn't have the courage to free his slaves. He just reasoned that his generation was not ready for it. And that he said they had the wolf by the ears and they dare not let it go, right? That black slaves had been mistreated for so long that if they were all just granted freedom, there'd be a rebellion. And so at any rate, yeah, you have all that going on with slavery. And also he believed in the innate, the just DNA born inferiority of black people, of African Americans. So you know what I mean? This guy was riddled with contradictions. And then lastly, what I think of is he got us involved in a foreign war in North Africa against Tunisia. It was known as the Tripolitan War or the Barbary Coast War. And he did a lot of it without Congress. And of course, that was what he complained about with George III, sending boys overseas to die without Parliament's consent. And that's what he does in North Africa because they're engaging in piracy. And he says that we need to balance our budget. And we couldn't balance our budget, he said, with the economic ill effects of this piracy. So he sent the USS Philadelphia to punish them, and they got captured and held for ransom as hostages. He sent a guy named William Eaton, to try a coup to overthrow this guy named Yusuf Karamanli, and it failed. And so then word gets out of all that he's been doing, and Congress was furious. The people were furious because he was doing it without congressional consent or even knowledge. And so you see what I mean? And then lastly, he always talked about the intellectual free pursuit of truth, that you should surround yourself from people from all spectrums, all sides of the political and ideological spectrum, and that the truth has nothing to fear from falsehood, that it'll somehow rise above and be adhered to by the majority of people, at least in the long run. And when he became president, he tried it a little bit, putting conservatives in his cabinet, and they had such passionate arguments at his dinner table that he almost had a nervous breakdown. And so he namely put yes men, Democrats, liberals in his cabinet, instead of surrounding himself, like he said, you ought to, with the full ideological spectrum of people. So you see what I mean? How they call this guy like a fox, an enigma, a puzzle, because he was just riddled with contradictions. And then I'll say one last thing is he did not win definitively by a majority of electoral points in 1800. And so it came down to him and Aaron Burr, the same Aaron Burr that killed Hamilton. And the House has to decide, right? The two highest votes, and the House met with him, and we don't know what was spoken. So some people say that he kept Hamilton's economic system intact and behaved in such a conservative manner based upon a promise to Congress if they should choose him as the president instead of Aaron Burr. And of course, Hamilton said, right, I'm opposed to most of Jefferson's policies, absolutely, but I respect him as a man. And he said, Aaron Burr is a scoundrel. He's an immoral scoundrel. And that's when Aaron Burr wrote ill of him, and they had this writing duel, and it turned into an actual duel. And Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton in Weehawken, New Jersey. All right. So are there any questions? I think that's all. That's supposed to be Eston, his youngest son. And when he got older, that's Sally Hemings, his lover. That's a picture, of course, of the Barbary Coast War. And that's Lewis and Clark Expedition. So look at that Louisiana Purchase. Look how big that is. It's going to end up being like 19 states in the future.
Yeah, that's something that's always amazed me is how cheap they bought the land for in the
Yes.
Louisiana Purchase. And that's ended up turning into the United States today. It's like mind blowing.
It is. It is. It allegedly. I used to know the numbers, and I don't have them memorized. I'm sorry, but yeah, it was evidently a steal of a deal. All right. Thank you guys. Thank you for hanging in there. Okay, I appreciate, especially on Halloween. I'm gonna mark this down that it is Halloween. And I think I'm gonna give you a couple extra points. All right, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, so you guys enjoy yourselves tonight, okay? Be safe though.
I will do. Thank you so much, Professor Cowell.
Thank you. You guys take care. Both of
All
you.
right,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye-bye.